Han Tae-kyung stood in the center of the executive suite on the top floor of the Han Tower, and for the first time in 3 years, the air felt thin. The mahogany desk was barren. The tablet that usually sat at a perfect 45-degree angle was gone. The small porcelain dish where she kept the organic peppermint candies he liked, the ones he pretended to hate but ate every afternoon, had been emptied and wiped clean. There was a clinical, haunting perfection to the room that suggested Jade Lawson had never been there at all. 10 minutes ago, his lead enforcer, Sangwoo, had entered the boardroom with a silver tray, a single ivory envelope, and a tension in his jaw that Tae-kyung hadn't seen since the 2021 dock raids. It was the stance of a soldier delivering news of a lost war. The resignation was 3 sentences. Effective immediately, I am resigning from my position as executive assistant. My personal files have been wiped and my keys are on the blotter. Thank you for the opportunity, Jade Lawson. Tae-kyung had stared at the signature until the ink blurred. Then, he had dismissed a room full of international investors without a word and walked into the silence of his office. Now, the silence was deafening. Tae-kyung had commanded the Han Syndicate for over a decade. He had stepped into the blood-soaked shoes of his father at 24 and turned a crumbling street gang into a global conglomerate that dictated the pace of the Seoul Stock Exchange. At 34, he was a ghost in a bespoke suit, a man who could stare down a rival boss with a gun to his chest and not break a sweat. He had liquidated companies and enemies alike with the same surgical detachment. But right now, standing in an office that still held the faint, lingering warmth of cocoa butter and expensive stationery, a jagged, unfamiliar pressure was tightening behind his ribs. It was a sensation he couldn't calculate or categorize. Jade had been his shadow for 3 years. She was the architect of his schedule, the guardian of his secrets, and the only person in the world who knew exactly how he liked his scotch after a bad day. She was his assistant, a replaceable part of the machine. Or so he had told himself until the machine stopped breathing. Before we begin, please hit that like button and comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. Now, let's dive in. The heavy ivory paper felt like a slab of cold marble in Han Tae-kyung's hand. He sat behind his desk, the silence of the penthouse pressing against his eardrums like a physical weight. Just 10 minutes ago, the room had been filled with the sharp, rhythmic sounds of Jade's presence, the soft click of her heels, the rustle of reports, the faint, comforting chime of her organizing his life. Now there was only this. He read the words again, his eyes narrowing as he traced the elegant, sharp loops of her handwriting. I can no longer fulfill my duties. Thank you for the opportunity. A dry, harsh scoff escaped his throat, sounding jagged in the quiet room. Unprofessional, he muttered to the empty air, his voice tight with a brewing storm of indignation. He tossed the letter onto the polished blotter, watching it slide toward the edge as if it too wanted to leave him. To Tae-kyung, the world was built on contracts, ironclad agreements, and the unspoken debt of loyalty. People didn't just walk away from the Han Syndicate. They didn't leave a hole in the center of a billion-dollar operation with a 3-sentence note. He stood up, his chair scraping violently against the floor, and paced to the window. Below him, the lights of Seoul pulsed like a circuit board, vast and controllable. He had spent his entire adult life mastering this city, turning every variable into a predictable outcome. He had handled the betrayal of senior board members and the aggression of rival families without losing a night's sleep. He was the man who turned chaos into order. Yet, as he looked at the empty peppermint dish on the corner of his desk, the order felt hollow. It was a minor inconvenience, he told himself. A staffing error. He would simply call the most elite headhunting firm in the country and have 5 more Jades lined up by sunrise. He would find someone with more experience, someone who understood that a position like this was not something you simply discarded on a whim. He reached for his phone to call Sangwoo, intending to order an immediate audit of Jade's accounts. He wanted to find a reason for her departure, a bribe, a threat, a secret. It was easier to believe she was a traitor than to believe she had simply chosen to exist elsewhere. But as his finger hovered over the screen, he caught a scent. It was subtle, nearly gone. the faint, lingering trace of cocoa butter that always seemed to follow her. It was the smell of the woman who had sat up with him until 3:00 a.m. while he recovered from a lung infection, the woman who had memorized the names of his sister's doctors without being asked. His hand trembled just a fraction before he steadied it. He forced his face back into the mask of the cold, untouchable chairman. She was an employee. She had resigned. The reason didn't matter, and the loss was merely a logistical hurdle. "Find a replacement by tomorrow," he commanded when Sangwoo finally answered. "The most qualified candidate available. I don't care about the cost." He hung up and stared back at the ivory paper. He had replaced entire divisions of men before. Surely, one woman would be no different. But even as the thought formed, the silence in the office felt louder, mocking the king who sat on a throne that Jade Lawson had built for him. The woman standing where Jade should have been was a marvel of efficiency. Her name was Alina, a triple threat with an Ivy League MBA, a background in corporate intelligence, and a resume that had cost T. Kyung a small fortune to secure on such short notice. She sat at the mahogany desk with a posture so rigid it made T. Kyung's own back ache just looking at her. She didn't hum while she worked. She didn't keep organic peppermint candies in a porcelain dish. She kept a digital tablet synced to his biometric data, providing him with a stream of information that was cold, accurate, and utterly lifeless. "Chairman, your 10:00 a.m. with the Logistics Union has been moved forward by 15 minutes to account for the traffic patterns near the Han River," Alina stated, her voice a flat, professional melody. "I have also updated your security clearance for the new server. Is there anything else?" T. Kyung stared at her, his hands buried deep in his pockets. On paper, she was superior to Jade in every measurable way. She moved with a surgical precision that should have appealed to his obsession with control. But as the morning wore on, the perfect order of the office began to feel like a suffocating vacuum. At 11:00 a.m., Alina placed a cup of coffee on his desk. It was the exact roast he had listed in his corporate profile, Blue Mountain Black, served at precisely 175 degrees F. T. Kyung took a sip and nearly choked. It was technically perfect, yet it tasted like ash. Jade never followed his profile. She knew that on rainy Tuesdays, he preferred a dark roast with a splash of cream because the bitterness of the weather required a different kind of warmth. She knew the profile was a lie he told the world to appear more disciplined than he was. Alina followed the script. Jade had known the man. By mid-afternoon, the crumbling became more pronounced. T. Kyung found himself reaching for the phone to ask a question about his sister's physical therapy schedule, only to stop with his hand hovering over the receiver. Alina wouldn't know the therapist's name was Dr. Choi, nor would she know that his sister hated the Tuesday sessions because the room was too cold. Jade had managed those details in the margins of her notebooks, things that weren't duties, but were the very fabric of his sanity. "Chairman," Alina's voice broke his trance. She was holding a file. "The merger documents are ready for your signature. I've highlighted the clauses that require your specific attention." T. Kyung looked at the yellow highlights. They were efficient. They were helpful. They were wrong. Jade never used highlights. She used small, handwritten sticky notes that explained why a clause was dangerous, often adding a witty remark about the rival CEO's lack of imagination. He took the pen, but his grip was too tight. He looked at Alina's polished, expectant face and felt a surge of irrational irritation. She was doing everything right, and yet the office felt like a stage set where the lead actress had been replaced by a mannequin. The empire was running smoothly, the numbers were climbing, and the logistics were flawless. But as the scent of Alina's expensive floral perfume, so different from the warm, earthy cocoa butter that used to live here, hit his senses, T. Kyung realized he wasn't just losing his grip on his schedule. He was losing the only version of himself that was actually human. "Leave the file," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous low. "And don't bring me coffee again. I'll get it myself." As she stepped out, clicking the door shut with a quiet, professional snap, T. Kyung let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He was surrounded by the best talent money could buy, yet he had never felt more isolated. The new Jade was a ghost in a designer suit, and every second she spent in the room only served to highlight the screaming absence of the woman who had actually known his soul. T. Kyung was a man who believed in the absolute victory of the mind over the body. He had survived interrogations and high-stakes betrayals by compartmentalizing his physical reactions, burying his fear so deep it became fuel. But as he stepped into the back of his armored sedan late that evening, the carefully constructed walls of his psyche began to weep. The car was pristine, detailed by a professional crew just hours before. The leather was cold, smelling of chemical cleaners and sterile vacuumed air. Yet as he reached for the seatbelt, his hand brushed against something soft wedged into the crease of the seat, something the cleaners had missed. He pulled it out slowly. It was a silk scarf, deep emerald green, patterned with golden chains. It was Jade's. The moment he lifted it, the scent hit him. It wasn't the sharp, artificial floral of the office cleaners or the aggressive musk of his own cologne. It was the scent of cocoa butter, warm skin, and a hint of the expensive vanilla bean tea she drank during long nights of crisis management. It was a scent that didn't belong in a war room or a mafia stronghold. It belonged to the only person who had ever looked at him as a man rather than a title. Suddenly, the oxygen in the car seemed to vanish. T. Kyung's chest tightened, a jagged pressure blooming behind his ribs that made every breath feel like he was inhaling crushed glass. His vision blurred at the edges, the lights of Seoul outside the window smearing into long, distorted streaks of neon. He felt his heart hammering against his chest wall, a frantic, erratic rhythm that defied his command. He tried to loosen his tie, his fingers fumbling and clumsy. It was a panic attack, a weakness he had only seen in others and had always despised. He refused to acknowledge it. He was Han T. Kyung. He didn't panic. He was merely tired. The air conditioning was simply malfunctioning. He squeezed the silk in his fist until his knuckles turned white, trying to ground himself in the physical reality of the fabric. But the scent was relentless. It wasn't just a smell. It was a memory of Jade sitting in this very seat, her head tilted back as she laughed at one of his rare, dry jokes. It was the memory of her handing him a tablet with a steady hand while he was shaking with rage, her calm being the only thing that kept him from making a move that would have started a war. With her gone, the shield was gone. He was exposed to the elements, and for the first time in 11 years, the Ice King felt the cold. "Drive," he rasped, his voice sounding like it was coming from miles away. Sang-woo glanced at him through the rear-view mirror, his eyes widening slightly at the sight of his boss's pale, sweat-slicked forehead. "Chairman, are you all right?" "I said drive," T. Kyung snapped, though the command lacked its usual bite. He shoved the scarf into the inner pocket of his coat, hiding it away like a piece of contraband. He leaned his head against the cold glass of the window, forcing his breathing to slow, fighting the tremor in his hands. He told himself it was just a lingering phantom of a former employee. But as the car glided through the dark streets, the hidden weight of the silk against his heart told a different, more terrifying story. By the next morning, T. Kyung's vulnerability had hardened into a sharp, dangerous cynicism. If his body was going to betray him with panic, he would redirect that energy toward the only thing he knew how to handle: a threat. He sat in the war room, the emerald scarf hidden in his breast pocket like a secret wound, while his top advisors sat in a semicircle of uneasy silence. The air was thick with the scent of ozone from the cooling units and the metallic tang of high-end electronics, but T. Kyung could only think of the absence of peppermint. "The merger specs for the Jeju development are missing from the secure drive," Sang-woo announced, his voice cautious. He didn't look his boss in the eye. "Access logs show the last person to open the encrypted folder was Jade Lawson, 4 hours before she submitted her resignation." A low murmur rippled through the advisors. In the world of the Han Syndicate, missing files were never an accident. They were a declaration of war. T. Kyung felt a strange, dark relief wash over him. If Jade was a thief, then his obsession with her wasn't a weakness, it was a necessity. If she was a traitor, then the tightness in his chest wasn't love. It was the instinct of a predator who had been bitten by his own pet. She was always too quiet, one of the younger lieutenants muttered, emboldened by the chairman's stony expression. A woman like that from nowhere. She probably found a better bidder in the Kim family. She's likely halfway to Busan with our proprietary data by now. T. Kyung's jaw tightened until it throbbed. He knew Jade wasn't a thief. He knew her integrity was the only thing in his life that hadn't been bought. But he needed the lie. He needed a reason to use the full weight of his empire to drag her back into his orbit without admitting he simply couldn't breathe in a world where she didn't exist. Find her, T. Kyung said, his voice a low, vibrating growl that silenced the room. I want every black market informant from here to Jeju on high alert. Check the ports, the private airfields, and every medical clinic in the city. If she so much as buys a bottle of water, I want to know about it. Chairman, Alina interrupted, her voice a clinical intrusion. Standard protocol for a data breach of this magnitude suggests we notify the board and freeze her personal assets immediately. It is the most efficient way to. I don't care about the board, T. Kyung snapped, slamming his palm against the glass table. The sound echoed like a gunshot. And I don't care about efficiency. I want her brought to me, unharmed. If a single hair on her head is touched by one of your efficient recovery teams, I will personally ensure they never see the sun again. He stood up and walked out of the room before they could respond, his coat billowing behind him. He didn't believe she had stolen the file. It was likely buried in a subfolder he was too distracted to find. But the traitor theory was the only leash he had left. As he marched toward his private elevator, he felt the emerald silk of the scarf press against his heart. The manhunt was beginning, but T. Kyung knew deep down that he wasn't hunting a criminal. He was hunting the only mirror that showed him a version of himself he didn't hate. The neon sign of a cramped jazz bar in Itaewon flickered, casting rhythmic blue shadows across the face of Naomi, the only person Jade had ever called a friend. T. Kyung sat in a velvet booth in the far corner, his presence a dark blot on the vibrant, messy atmosphere of the place. He was surrounded by 4 of his most imposing guards, their suits sharp and their faces stone, creating a wall of muscle that usually made grown men tremble. He had come here to hunt a traitor, to squeeze the truth out of someone until Jade's location surfaced like a desperate breath. Naomi didn't tremble. She didn't even stop wiping down the glass in her hand when T. Kyung leaned forward, his eyes cold and predatory. I'll ask you one more time, T. Kyung said, his voice dropping into that low, dangerous register that had ended careers and started wars. Where is she? Jade doesn't have the resources to disappear on her own. You're her only contact. If you're hiding her, you're interfering with a syndicate investigation. You know what that means. He waited for the flicker of fear, the stutter in her breath, the telltale sign of a weak link breaking. Instead, Naomi slowly put down the glass and looked at him. She didn't look at his bodyguards. She didn't look at the expensive watch on his wrist or the power he radiated like heat. She looked directly into his eyes, and what he saw there wasn't terror. It was pity. You really think she's running from a file, don't you? Naomi asked, her voice quiet but steady. You think she's hiding in some dark alleyway because she's scared of you. She stole from the Han Syndicate, T. Kyung lied, the emerald scarf in his pocket feeling like a hot brand against his chest. I am protecting my interests. Naomi let out a short, sad laugh that cut through his authority more effectively than a blade. She worked for you for 3 years, T. Kyung. She knew the names of your enemies before you did. She knew which tie you pick based on how much sleep you got. And you still don't know a damn thing about her. T. Kyung's jaw tightened. I know she disappeared when things got difficult. I know she left without a word. She left because she didn't want you to see her break, Naomi said, her gaze softening into a look of profound sorrow. It was the look a mother gives a child who is lost but too proud to ask for directions. You keep looking for a criminal, Chairman. You keep sending your men to search the shadows. But Jade isn't in the shadows. She's in the light, doing something you aren't brave enough to do. What is she doing? He demanded, his composure finally fracturing. He reached out, his hand hovering over the bar as if to seize the truth by force. Naomi just shook her head and turned back to the shelf of bottles. I won't tell you. Not because I'm scared of what you'll do to me, but because if you find her now, you'll just ruin the one thing she has left to give. You're a powerful man, T. Kyung. You own half of this city, but you're the poorest person I've ever met. He left the bar with the silence of her pity ringing louder than the jazz. He was the boss of the Hand Syndicate, a man who commanded fear by instinct, yet a bartender in Itaewon had just looked at him and seen a vacuum. As he stepped back into the cold night air, the traitor theory felt like a crumbling mask. He wasn't hunting a thief. He was being haunted by a woman he had never truly seen. The following morning, T. Kyung was packing the length of his office, the emerald scarf still tucked like a secret curse against his ribs, when his phone vibrated with a priority alert from the Seoul National University Hospital. He braced himself for a ransom demand or a threat from a rival syndicate, his jaw tightening as he pressed the device to his ear. Instead, he heard the breathless, trembling voice of his younger sister's primary physician. "Chairman Han, you need to come to the clinic immediately," Dr. Choi stammered, his usual clinical detachment replaced by a feverish excitement. "It's Minna. The crisis has passed. Her cell counts are stabilizing at a rate we haven't seen in years. It's a miracle." T. Kyung froze, his hand tightening on the edge of his desk. His sister, Minna, was the only person left in his world who carried his blood, the only person who remembered him before he became a monster. She had been fatting for months, a rare autoimmune condition slowly turning her body into a prison. He had spent millions, exhausted the world's best medical minds, and yet he had been told to prepare for the end. "What changed?" T. Kyung rasped, his mind already spinning toward Jade's absence. "You said there were no matches on the global registry. You said she was out of time." "We found a donor, Chairman," the doctor explained, his voice echoing through the speaker. "A perfect match. An anonymous altruistic donation was processed 48 hours ago under a high-priority emergency protocol. The procedure was successful. Her body isn't just accepting the marrow, it's thriving. It's as if the donor was her own twin." T. Kyung should have felt a tidal wave of relief. He should have dropped to his knees in gratitude. But his mind was a storm of conflicting data points. 48 hours ago, the exact window of Jade's disappearance. The same time his traitorous assistant had allegedly been scrubbing her digital footprint. "I want the donor's name," T. Kyung demanded, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous rumble. "I want to know who entered that facility." "I'm sorry, Chairman, but the paperwork was signed under a strict non-disclosure agreement with a legal firm out of Hong Kong," the doctor replied, sounding genuinely regretful. "The donor was adamant about remaining invisible. They didn't even want the standard compensation. They just wanted the surgery done immediately." T. Kyung let out a sharp, frustrated breath. He didn't have time for mysteries or miracles. In his world, nothing was free, and everything was a move in a larger game. He was convinced this was a trap. Perhaps a rival had bought his sister's life to hold over his head later. "Focus on her recovery," he ordered, hanging up before the doctor could protest. He turned to Sangwoo, who was standing by the door. "Ignore the hospital for now. What about the ports? Did the girl in Busan turn out to be Jade?" "No, Chairman, just a lookalike," Sangwoo replied, his face grim. T. Kyung slammed his fist against the window, the glass vibrating against his knuckles. His sister was coming back from the dead, and yet the only thing he could feel was the hollow, burning ache of Jade's silence. He was so blinded by the need to find the thief, who had stolen his peace, that he couldn't see the blood on the hands of the woman who had just saved his world. The dots were right in front of him, glowing in the dark, but he was too busy hunting a ghost to notice the miracle. The penthouse was submerged in the heavy, ink-blue shadows of 3 in the morning. T. Kyung sat alone in the darkness of his private monitoring room, the only light reflecting off the wall of high-definition screens. He had dismissed Alina hours ago, ignoring her efficient reminders about his sleep schedule. He had also ignored the hospital updates about his sister's remarkable stability. Instead, he was obsessively scrolling through the digital archives of the night Jade Lawson disappeared. His fingers moved with frantic precision over the controls, backtracking through the grain of the midnight security feed. He was looking for the heist. He was looking for the moment she tucked the missing merger files into her handbag or copied encrypted data onto a thumb drive. He needed the proof of her betrayal to justify the cold ache in his ribs. "Show me," he whispered to the screen, his voice raw. "Show me who you really are." The footage flickered, stabilizing on the camera positioned in the corner of his main office. The time stamp read 11:42 p.m. The room was empty until the heavy oak doors pushed open. Jade walked in. She wasn't wearing her usual sharp blazer. She was in a simple sweater, looking smaller and more fragile than he had ever permitted himself to notice. Tae-kyung leaned forward, his eyes narrowed. He watched her move toward his desk. She didn't head for the safe. She didn't touch his computer. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out a small microfiber cloth and a bottle of wood polish. He watched, paralyzed, as she began to clean. It was a slow, methodical ritual. She polished the surface of his desk where he usually rested his elbows. She straightened the fountain pen he always left at an untidy angle. She spent a long minute cleaning the porcelain dish that used to hold his peppermints. Then she stopped. Her shoulders began to shake. Tae-kyung's breath hitched. On the silent, flickering screen, Jade Lawson leaned her forehead against the cool wood of his desk and wept. It wasn't the dramatic sob of a woman caught in a lie. It was the quiet, shoulder-shaking grief of someone saying a final, agonizing goodbye. She stayed like that for a long time, her hand resting on the spot where he sat every day, as if she were trying to draw some last bit of warmth from the furniture. When she finally stood up, she wiped her face, took one long, lingering look at the empty chair, and placed the ivory resignation letter exactly in the center of the blotter. She didn't look back as she walked out of the frame. The video looped, starting over from the moment she entered, but Tae-kyung couldn't move to stop it. The traitor theory shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces of glass. She hadn't stolen anything. She had spent her final moments in his world making sure his desk was perfect for the morning. The emerald scarf in his pocket felt like it was burning through his skin. He realized then that Jade hadn't left because she was tired of him, or because she had found a better bidder. She had left because she was breaking under the weight of something he had been too blind to see. As the silent footage played for the 10th time, Tae-kyung didn't see an assistant. He saw a woman who had been loving a ghost, and he felt a physical collapse beginning in the very center of his soul. The following afternoon, Tae-kyung sat at the head of a massive mahogany table in a private club, the air thick with the smell of expensive cigars and the heavy, electric tension of a ceasefire that was beginning to rot. Across from him sat Chairman Park, a man whose smile always looked like a wound. Park was the head of a rival faction that had been circling the Han Syndicate's territory for months, waiting for a single moment of instability to strike. "You look tired, Han," Park said, leaning back and swirling a glass of amber liquid. "They say the Great Ice King is melting. I hear you've turned your entire intelligence network into a private detective agency, all for a runaway assistant." Tae-kyung didn't move. His face was a mask of stone, but beneath the table, his hand was gripped tightly around the emerald silk scarf in his pocket. "My internal affairs are not your concern, Park. Focus on your shipping lanes. They're getting crowded." Park laughed, a sharp, grating sound. "Internal affairs. Tae-kyung, everyone knows she was the only one who could read the fine print on your contracts before you signed them. She was the one who kept the peace with the unions. Now, you're firing your best people because they can't make your coffee right. You're exposed." The insult was deliberate, a jagged hook meant to draw blood. Tae-kyung felt a surge of white-hot rage, a primitive urge to reach across the table and crush the life out of the man. His security team shifted behind him, hands moving toward their holsters, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. The room was one word away from becoming a slaughterhouse. "She was a tool," Tae-kyung lied, his voice a low, vibrating growl. "Nothing more." "A tool?" Park leaned forward, his eyes glinting with malice. "Then why is your empire stuttering? Without her, you're just a man with a title and a lot of enemies. She wasn't your assistant, Han. She was your shield. She was the one who smoothed over your arrogance before it cost you your head. And now that she's realized you're not worth the effort, we're all wondering who's going to take your seat. T. Kyung stood up so abruptly his chair toppled backward. The sound echoed like a gunshot. He leaned over the table, his face inches from Park's, his shadow stretching across the room like a shroud. The Ice King was gone. In his place was a predator who had lost the only thing that kept him tethered to the world of men. "One more word," T. Kyung whispered, the threat so cold it seemed to drop the temperature of the room. "One more mention of her name from your mouth, and I will burn every dock you own until the sea itself is on fire. I don't need a shield to kill you." Park paled, the mockery dying in his throat as he realized he had pushed too far. He saw the madness in T. Kyung's eyes, the frantic, desperate energy of a man who had nothing left to lose because he had already lost everything that mattered. T. Kyung turned and walked out, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against the emerald scarf. He had won the exchange, but as he stepped into the cold afternoon air, Park's words echoed in his mind. "She was your shield." He realized then that it wasn't just the logistics or the coffee. Jade had been the barrier between him and the monster he was becoming. Without her, he wasn't just losing his empire, he was losing his soul to the war. T. Kyung returned to his office long after the city had fallen into a restless slumber. The confrontation with Park had left him wired with a frantic, destructive energy that no amount of scotch could dull. He sat behind his desk, the emerald scarf draped over his knuckles, and began to pull open the drawers Jade had used, one by one. He told himself he was still looking for evidence of the missing files, but his hands were searching for something else, a tether, a sign that she hadn't truly erased herself. In the bottommost drawer of her desk, hidden beneath a stack of blank letterheads and a spare keyboard, his fingers brushed against a small, leather-bound volume. It was a ledger, its edges worn smooth by frequent use. He pulled it out, expecting to find encrypted bank accounts or a list of underworld contacts. Instead, as he flipped the pages, T. Kyung felt the air leave his lungs for the second time that week. It wasn't a record of money or secrets. It was a map of his empire's soul. The ledger was filled with Jade's meticulous, elegant handwriting. There were names, not just of the high-ranking lieutenants, but of the drivers, the security guards, and the cleaning staff. Next to each name was a detailed list of personal data: food allergies, children's birthdays, the dates their parents had passed away, and their favorite brands of cigarettes or types of tea. He saw a note next to Sang-woo's name: son's asthma flaring in October. Remind the chairman to authorize the private clinic referral. He saw a notation for a junior guard he barely recognized: mother's anniversary is the 12th. Send white lilies. He's too proud to ask for the day off. T. Kyung's hand trembled as he realized that for 3 years, Jade had been the invisible glue holding the Han syndicate together. She had been the one who anticipated the grievances before they became betrayals. She had been the one who made these hardened, violent men feel like they were part of a family rather than a machine. He had thought his empire ran on fear and his own iron will, but the ledger proved he was wrong. It ran on the quiet, tireless compassion of a woman he had treated like an appliance. He found a page at the back of the book, dated just a week before she left. It was titled simply, Minna. Beneath it was an exhaustive list of his sister's medications, her favorite songs for the days she felt too weak to speak, and a specific note written in bold ink: the cold is her enemy. Ensure the heating in the south wing never drops below 24 degrees C. A sudden, sharp realization pierced through his chest. Jade hadn't been a beautiful assistant who managed his schedule. She had been the heart that kept the entire syndicate beating while he was busy playing the Ice King. She had seen the humanity in everyone around him, even when he had done everything in his power to crush it. He closed the ledger, the weight of it feeling heavier than any weapon he had ever carried. He looked at the empty office, at the replacement assistant's sterile, digital reports, and felt a wave of profound nausea. Park was right. He was exposed. Not because he was weak, but because he had let the only person who actually protected his people walk out into the night with a secret that was clearly destroying her. Kyung didn't just need to find her to save his empire. He needed to find her because he finally understood that without her, he was just a man presiding over a graveyard. The hunt for Jade Lawson had reached a fever pitch. Kyung sat in his dim monitoring room, the air thick with the hum of servers and the low, urgent murmurs of his cyber-intelligence team. He had spent the last 48 hours oscillating between a cold, predatory focus and a mounting sense of existential dread. The discovery of the ledger had humanized the void she left behind, but it hadn't brought her back. "Chairman, we found a breach in the firewall of a private financial group in Hong Kong," his lead hacker announced, his fingers flying across a mechanical keyboard. "A shell company linked to Jade Lawson's secondary savings account just cleared a wire transfer. It's a significant amount, nearly $300,000. Kyung's eyes snapped to the screen. A digital receipt flickered into view. The recipient wasn't a travel agency or an offshore bank. It was a private surgical wing at the St. Jude Medical Center, a facility known for its absolute discretion and high-end aesthetic procedures. "St. Jude," Kyung's voice was a low, dangerous rasp. His mind immediately pivoted back to his original cynicism. He felt a sharp, bitter twist in his chest. She's changing her face. She's using the money she saved to buy a new identity. She's not just leaving, she's erasing the woman I knew so I can never find her. The logic was flawless in the world of the syndicate. In his line of work, people only spent that kind of money at St. Jude for one reason: to disappear. It was the ultimate betrayal. He had been looking for a woman who cared about his sister and his men, but the data was telling him she was a ghost who had already moved on to her next life. "The payment was flagged as a surgical prep and recovery fee," the hacker continued. "The procedure is scheduled for an inpatient stay. If we move now, we can intercept her before she enters the theater." Kyung stood up, his chair crashing against the floor. The emerald scarf was still in his pocket, but he gripped it now with a sense of fury. He felt foolish for the sentiment he had allowed himself to feel over the ledger. He had been mourning a heart, and she had been negotiating a price for a new mask. "Assemble the tactical team," he commanded, his face hardening into the mask of the Ice King. "I don't want the hospital staff alerted. We're going to St. Jude. If she thinks she can pay $300,000 to forget who I am, she's about to find out that some debts can't be settled with a wire transfer." As he walked toward the elevator, his heart was a drum of war. He told himself he was angry because she was escaping justice. He told himself he was moving this fast to protect the syndicate's secrets. But deep down, beneath the layers of Mafia boss and billionaire, he was terrified. He was terrified that by the time he reached the hospital, the Jade who knew how he liked his scotch and how his sister breathed would already be gone, replaced by a stranger he had driven into the shadows. He wasn't just hunting a traitor. He was racing to stop her from killing the only version of him that mattered. The black motorcade screeched to a halt in the circular drive of St. Jude Medical Center, the tires smoking against the pristine pavement. Kyung stepped out before his security detail could even open his door, his long coat snapping in the wind like a predator's wings. He didn't look like a man visiting a hospital. He looked like a general arriving to oversee an execution. "Secure the exits," Kyung commanded, his voice a jagged edge that cut through the sterile evening air. "No one enters or leaves the private wing until I say so. If the hospital administration interferes, tell them the Hand Syndicate is conducting a private audit." He marched through the sliding glass doors, his boots echoing with a rhythmic, violent thud against the polished marble. His men fanned out behind him, a wall of dark suits and mirrored sunglasses that sent the night shift nurses scattering. He didn't check in. He didn't ask for directions. He had the floor number, and the room designation burned into his mind like a target. As the elevator climbed toward the VIP surgical floor, Kyung felt the weight of the emerald scarf in his pocket. His hand tightened around it. He was ready for the new Jade. He was ready to see a face bandages had hidden, a woman who had used his sister's crisis as a distraction to fund her own disappearance. He felt a twisted, vengeful satisfaction at the thought of catching her. If she wanted a new life, he would make sure she lived it in a cage of his design. The doors chimed open to a floor that was unnervingly quiet. It was the sanctuary of the ultra-wealthy, a place where secrets were bought with seven-figure checks. T. Kyung ignored the startled floor manager and headed straight for room 702. His blood was singing with a dark, focused adrenaline. He reached the door and didn't knock. He shoved it open with enough force to rattle the hinges, stepping into the room with his hand already reaching for the traitor. "Did you think it would be that easy, Jade?" he started, his voice dripping with a cold, terrifying irony. "Did you think $300,000 was enough to—" The words died in his throat. The room was bathed in the soft, rhythmic hum of a heart monitor and the pale blue glow of a specialized recovery unit. There were no plastic surgeons here. There were no catalogs for new faces. Instead, the air smelled faintly of antiseptic and, impossibly, the lingering, ghostly scent of cocoa butter. Jade Lawson lay in the center of the bed, her skin a shade paler than the white linens. She was hooked to a complex array of IV drips and a post-surgical drain. Her breathing was shallow, supported by a thin oxygen tube. She wasn't hiding behind bandages. She was recovering from a massive, invasive procedure. T. Kyung's posture shattered. The Ice King didn't just melt, he fractured. He looked at the medical chart hanging at the foot of her bed, the one he had assumed was for a nose job or a cheek lift. His eyes scanned the surgical notes: acute allogeneic transplant, high-risk marrow and tissue harvest, donor compatibility, 99.9% to patient Han Minna. The floor seemed to tilt beneath his boots. He reached out to steady himself against the wall, his breath hitching in a way that sounded like a sob. He wasn't in a hideout. He was in a sanctuary of sacrifice. He looked at Jade, still, fragile form, and realized that while he had been hunting a ghost, she had been quietly dying to keep his only family alive. T. Kyung stood paralyzed in the doorway of room 702, the silence of the surgical wing now feeling like a physical weight pressing the air from his lungs. The emerald scarf was still clutched in his hand, a mockery of the traitor he had come to punish. His eyes were fixed on Jade's pale, sleeping face, but his mind was racing through the wreckage of his own assumptions. A soft footfall sounded behind him. Dr. Choi appeared, his face haggard but glowing with the exhaustion of a successful miracle. He didn't look at T. Kyung's guards or the dark energy radiating from the syndicate leader. He only looked at the woman in the bed with a reverence that made T. Kyung's stomach turn with shame. "You weren't supposed to find this floor, Chairman," the doctor whispered, motioning for T. Kyung to step toward the observation window that connected room 702 to the suite next door. T. Kyung moved like a man in a dream, his boots silent on the linoleum. He looked through the glass and stopped. There, in room 704, lay his sister Minna. She was hooked to the same monitors, the same IV lines, but her color was returning. The gray, deathly pallor that had haunted her for months was being replaced by a faint, healthy flush. "She found out," Dr. Choi said, standing beside him. "Jade. She came to me 3 weeks ago in private. She had been studying Minna's charts in secret, using her own time to consult with specialists in Europe. She realized that the reason we couldn't find a donor was that the match had to be perfect down to the rarest submarkers. She asked me to test her." "She isn't blood," T. Kyung rasped, his voice cracking like dry earth. "It's impossible." "Genetics is a strange mirror, Chairman. Jade Lawson was that 1 in a billion anomaly. A perfect match for a girl she barely knew. But the procedure for a donor in her condition was dangerous, extraordinarily so. It required a massive harvest of marrow and a partial liver lobe. It's a surgery that leaves the donor vulnerable to total system failure." T. Kyung looked back at Jade through the glass. The missing files, the stolen money. The $300,000 wasn't for a new face. It was to pay for the private surgical team, the legal NDAs, and the insurance to make sure Minna's treatment was never interrupted, even if Jade didn't wake up. She had used her entire life savings to buy his sister a second chance. She made me sign everything, the doctor continued. She said you were a man who hated being in debt, and if you knew what she was doing, you would stop her. She said she'd rather you hate her for leaving than have you feel obligated to love her for saving your family. She wanted to give you your sister back, even if it meant she had to disappear from your life forever. T. Kyung leaned his forehead against the cool glass, the emerald silk pressed between his palm and the window. The Ice King was dead. The man who managed empires and negotiated with cartels was gone, replaced by a brother who had been saved by the very woman he had hunted as a thief. The truth wasn't in the files or the ledgers. It was in the blood currently knitting his sister's life back together, Jade's blood. He had spent 3 years treating her like a shadow, never realizing she was the only light he had ever truly had. T. Kyung stood in the clinical, fluorescent hum of the hallway, his world narrowing down to a thin packet of papers the head nurse had just handed him. It was labeled Personal Directives, Jade Lawson. His hands, which had signed off on the dismantling of rival companies and ordered the most ruthless of syndicate strikes, were shaking so violently that the paper rattled like dry leaves in a storm. He leaned against the cold, tiled wall, his legs beginning to feel like they belonged to someone else. He opened the folder. It wasn't just a legal document. Tucked inside was a final, handwritten letter addressed to him. The ink was steady, a stark contrast to his own internal chaos. T. Kyung, it began. He winced at the use of his name, just his name, without the title, without the shield of his status. If you are reading this, it means the procedure was a success and Minna is safe. That is all that matters. Please, do not look for me. Do not turn this into one of your business debts. His breath hitched. He could almost hear her voice, calm, resolute, and devastatingly practical. I saw how you looked at your sister every day. I saw the ghost of your father's grief in your eyes whenever her fever spiked. You've spent your whole life paying for the sins of the Hand Syndicate, and I couldn't let you owe me for her life, too. If I stayed, you would look at me and see a debt you could never settle. You would try to protect me, to pay me back with gratitude, and that isn't the life I want for you. I wanted you to have your family back, free and clear. Let me be the one thing in your life that didn't come with a price tag. Let me go, so you can finally be a brother instead of a boss. The emerald scarf fell from his pocket, fluttering to the floor like a dying leaf. T. Kyung felt a sudden, agonizing pressure behind his sternum, the unfamiliar twisting he had felt in the car, now expanded into a total, systemic failure of his pride. He realized then that Jade Lawson hadn't just saved his sister's life. She had been trying to save his soul from the very transactional nature of his existence. She had sacrificed her health, her career, and her place by his side just to ensure he didn't feel indebted. The weight of her selfless love, so pure it didn't even require his acknowledgement, hit him with the force of a physical blow. His vision swam. The sterile white floor rushed up to meet him as his knees finally gave way. He didn't try to catch himself. He didn't care about the guards watching in stunned silence or the Ice King, persona he had spent 11 years perfecting. He collapsed into a heap in the middle of the hallway, his forehead resting on the cold floor, the letter clutched against his heart. A jagged, broken sound escaped him, a sob that had been a decade in the making. He was the most powerful man in Seoul, a billionaire with an army at his back, yet he was currently being undone by the realization that he was utterly unworthy of the woman in the room next door. He had replaced her with an Ivy League assistant. He had hunted her as a thief, and all the while she had been bleeding out to give him the only thing money couldn't buy: a future. The rhythmic, artificial chirping of the heart monitor was the first thing that pulled Jade from the heavy, velvet darkness of her sleep. Her body felt like lead, a dull, throbbing ache radiating from her side where they had taken a piece of her to mend a dying girl. For a moment, she panicked, her heart rate spiking as she remembered the cold, clinical finality of her resignation and the way she had scrubbed her existence from the Hand Tower. She had expected to wake up alone, a nameless donor in a quiet room, ready to disappear into the smog of Seoul. But as her eyes fluttered open, The light in the room wasn't the harsh, fluorescent glare of a hospital. It was soft, dimmed to a warm amber glow, and her hand wasn't resting on the sterile sheets. It was encased in a grip so steady and warm that it felt like an anchor. She turned her head slowly, wincing at the stiffness in her neck. T. Kyung was there. He wasn't the Ice King she had served for 3 years. He wasn't wearing the sharp, intimidating blazer or the cold, calculating expression that kept the underworld in check. He was sitting in a plastic hospital chair that looked far too small for him, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows and his hair disheveled. His eyes, usually as impenetrable as obsidian, were bloodshot and raw. "Jade," he whispered, his voice cracking. It was the sound of a man who had spent hours in a graveyard and had finally found a sign of life. You weren't supposed to find me," she rasped, her throat feeling like it was filled with sand. T. Kyung didn't pull away. He leaned forward, bringing her hand to his forehead. "I fired a leaner," he said, his voice a low, vibrating hum of regret. "I fired the Ivy League resumes. I fired the world-class efficiency. I realized I didn't want a perfect assistant. I wanted the woman who polishes my desk when she thinks I'm not looking. I wanted the woman who saved my sister's life while I was busy calling her a traitor." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the emerald silk scarf, placing it gently on her lap. "You left this in the car. It's the only thing that made sense to me for the last 72 hours. Jade looked at the scarf, then back at him. "T. Kyung, I can't be your debt. I didn't do this so you would owe me." "It's not a debt, Jade," he said, and for the first time she saw a tear escape the corner of his eye, tracing a path through the exhaustion on his face. "It's a realization. I've spent my whole life building an empire so I wouldn't have to be vulnerable, but standing in that hallway, reading your letter, I realized that an empire is just a pile of stones if you aren't there to tell me when the coffee is wrong." He squeezed her hand, his thumb stroking her knuckles. "I'm not asking the assistant to return to the Hand Syndicate. I'm asking you, Jade, to stay. Not because you owe me and not because I owe you, but because I finally know who I am when I'm with you. Just Han. No titles. No monsters." The silence that followed wasn't the loud, empty void of the penthouse. It was a quiet promise. Jade looked at the man who had finally collapsed to find his heart, and for the first time in her life, she didn't feel like she had to walk toward the light alone. She squeezed his hand back, a small, fragile smile touching her lips. The Ice King was gone, and in the warmth of that hospital room, the man had finally come home. I hope you enjoyed this story of Han T. Kyung and Jade Lawson. Please like and subscribe to see more stories like this. See you in my next video.